Mở cửa xe, ngay bây giờ. Tôi không làm gì sai. Tuân lệnh đi, ra khỏi xe. Đau quá, buông tay ra. Đừng chống cự, ra xe ngay. Tôi không đi đâu. Cảnh cáo lần cuối.
You people never learn, do you? Get out of the car. Officer Kane Ryder's fist came through the open window before Silas could even exhale. The first blow shattered the quiet. The second snapped his head sideways into the headrest. He yanked Silas Kane out of the vehicle by the collar and forced his hands behind his back. The handcuffs clicked tight enough to bite. Silas grimaced in pain, blood soaking the collar of his pressed white shirt, while his VFW pin caught the light of the cruiser's flashers. What Officer Ryder didn't know was that he had just ended his own career and triggered a multi-million-dollar lawsuit that was already writing itself. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because the next story is one you cannot miss. The school play had been wonderful. Silas Kane drove home with the kind of quiet satisfaction that only comes when the day ends better than it started. His daughter Lila had stood on that stage like she owned it, young and not a trace of nerves. He had sat in the third row with his arms folded and his chest full, trying very hard not to be the embarrassing dad who cried. He had almost succeeded. Now he was 2 blocks from home, windows cracked, the cool evening air sliding through the car. The streets of Crescent Avenue were lit up soft and gold, the kind of neighborhood light that makes everything look peaceful. Old oak trees lined both sides of the road. Houses sat close together. People around here knew each other's names, knew each other's dogs, looked out for each other. Silas had grown up on this street. He had come back to it on purpose. He was still in his work clothes, charcoal slacks, a pressed white shirt, a tie he had loosened maybe a couple of inches on the drive from the school. His Veterans of Foreign Wars lapel pin caught the light from a passing street lamp. He had worn that pin every day since he came home from his second tour, and he had never once left the house without it. He was humming an old song, soft and unhurried. The lights came on behind him without warning, red and blue, cutting hard through the rear window. Silas checked his speed. He was doing fine. He checked his mirrors. The cruiser sat close, too close, filling his rear view with flashing color. He took one slow breath in through his nose and let it out through his mouth. His hands stayed exactly where they were, 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. Visible. Still. He pulled over to the curb smoothly and cut the engine. 2 blocks from my house, he thought. 2 blocks. He had done this before. Not often, but enough times to know the procedure. Enough times to know that how you carried yourself in the next few minutes mattered in ways that had nothing to do with whether you had done anything wrong. He kept his hands on the wheel. In his side mirror, he watched the officer step out of the cruiser. White male, stocky through the shoulders. He walked like a man who had never once questioned whether he belonged wherever he was standing. His hand rested near his belt, even though nothing had happened to put it there. His body camera, Silas could see it clearly, sat dark and inactive on his chest. The officer reached the driver's window and stopped. He looked at Silas for a moment without saying anything. "License and registration," he said finally. Not a greeting, not a reason, just the demand. Flat and dry, like Silas was an inconvenience he had already decided how to handle. "Good evening, officer." Silas kept his voice even, calm, professional. "Can I ask what the stop is for?" The officer's jaw shifted slightly. Failure to signal a lane change. License and registration. Silas had not changed lanes. He had driven in a straight line from the school to this street. He knew that. He also knew that arguing the point on the side of the road was not going to accomplish anything useful. "Of course," Silas said. "My license is in my wallet in my back pocket. My registration is in the glove box. I'm going to reach for them now." He stated each word clearly, deliberately, the way you do when you need there to be absolutely no confusion about what your hands are going to do. The officer stared at him. Something moved behind his eyes. Not suspicion exactly. Something else. Something closer to irritation. The kind of irritation that does not come from what a person has done, but from how they are carrying themselves. From the pressed shirt, the tie, the way Silas had not looked away, the way his voice had stayed steady and dignified instead of nervous and small. "You always talk this much during a traffic stop," the officer said. Silas did not answer that. There was no answer worth giving. "I'm going to reach for my registration now," Silas said again, keeping his voice level. "It's in the glove box. I'm going to reach across with my right hand." He looked forward through the windshield, both hands still visible, still on the wheel. "Go ahead," the officer said. Silas began to move his right hand slowly toward the glove box. The punch came without warning. 1 second. Silas's hand was moving toward the glove box. Slow and deliberate, exactly as he had said it would. The next second, Officer Kane Ryder's fist was coming through the open window like a hammer, and the world exploded into white. The first blow caught Silas across the left side of his face. The second landed harder in almost the same spot, snapping his head sideways into the headrest. He did not fight back. He could not have told you why exactly, except that somewhere underneath the shock and the ringing in his skull, the part of him that had survived 2 combat deployments was still running cold calculations. Don't move. Don't react. Hands visible. Stay alive. He slumped sideways against the center console, ears ringing, tasting blood, where his lip had split against his teeth. The inside of the car seemed to tilt. The gold street light outside blurred and swam. "Get out of the car!" Ryder's voice came from somewhere above him, sharp and hard. "Get out now!" The door was wrenched open from outside. Silas moved slowly, every motion careful, deliberate. Hands out where they could be seen. His left eye was already swelling. He could feel the throb of it building with every heartbeat, a deep pressure behind the socket that told him something was badly wrong. He made it to the curb on his feet. Barely. "Hands behind your back," he complied. The handcuffs clicked into place tight enough to bite. Behind him, maybe 15 feet back, Officer Amara Quinn stood at the rear of Silas's car. She was young, black, and completely motionless. Her eyes moved from Silas to Ryder and back again. Her mouth was slightly open, like a word had started forming and then gotten stuck somewhere on the way out. She said nothing. She did not move toward Silas. She did not question Ryder. She stood there with her hands at her sides, and she looked at the pavement. "He resisted," Ryder said loud enough that it carried down the quiet street. He wasn't talking to Quinn. He was talking to the air, establishing a version of events before anyone could offer a different one. "Sudden movement toward the glove box. Resisted when I attempted to secure him." Silas stood on the sidewalk in front of the house, 3 doors down from the one he had grown up in. Blood running from his lip down his chin, hands cuffed behind his back, 2 blocks from his own front door. A woman had stopped on the sidewalk across the street. She was older, white-haired, holding the leash of a small brown dog. The dog had sat down at her feet. She was staring at Silas with both hands pressed over her mouth, the leash hanging slack, her eyes wide and fixed and horrified. Silas looked back at her for a moment. He wanted to say something. He didn't know what. Something that would make sense of what was happening. Something that would explain why a man in a pressed shirt and a VFW pin was standing on his own street in handcuffs, with blood on his face, after driving home from his daughter's school play. There was nothing to say. Ryder was already on his radio calling it in. His voice was steady and professional. The voice of a man who had done this before, who would do it again. who had never once expected to be questioned about any of it. Quinn had still not moved. The county jail smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee. They took Silas's belt, his phone, his wallet, and his VFW pin. A corrections officer dropped the pin into a small plastic bag and sealed it without looking at Silas, like it was nothing, like it was just another piece of property from just another arrest. Silas sat in the holding cell and did not speak. There were 2 other men in the cell. They left him alone. Maybe it was the dried blood on his face. Maybe it was the way he was sitting, straight back, shoulders square, chin level, staring at the middle distance, the way soldiers learn to stare when they are waiting for something they cannot control to be over. He thought about Lila. She had been so good up there on that stage. He pressed his tongue carefully against his split lip and breathed through his nose and waited. Hours. That was how long it took before anyone came. The cell was cold, and the light never changed. There were no windows, no way to tell what time it was or how long he had been sitting there. The fluorescent light above hummed at a steady, toneless pitch that never stopped, never varied, never gave you anything to hold on to. Silas sat with his back straight and his feet flat on the floor, and he breathed in through the nose, through the mouth, slow and even. It was something his army sergeant had drilled into him years ago in the Georgia heat during a training exercise that had broken 3 men in his unit before noon. You can't control what's happening around you. You can only control what's happening in here. The sergeant had tapped his own chest when he said it. You lose that, you lose everything. Silas had not lost it then. He was not going to lose it now. But underneath the breathing, underneath the stillness he was holding himself to, like it was the only solid thing left, something was building. Not panic, not rage. Something quieter and more dangerous than either of those. Something that felt like the slow recognition of a truth he had spent his entire adult life trying to disprove. He pressed it down and kept breathing. Celine got the call that evening. She had been at the kitchen table with her pre-law textbooks open and a half-eaten bowl of cereal going soggy beside her laptop. She read Silas's name on the screen and answered it on the first ring. By the time she reached the car, she was already moving. Later, she was at the county jail window, pushing bail money across the counter with hands that would not stop shaking, telling herself to hold it together. Hold it together. Hold it together. When Silas walked through the door into the waiting area, she made a sound she had never made before in her life. His left eye was swollen nearly shut. His lip was split and crusted over. There was dried blood on the collar of his white shirt, rust-colored against the pressed fabric. He was carrying a small plastic bag with his belt and his wallet and his VFW pin inside it. And he was walking like every step required a separate decision. He looked at her and said, "I'm okay." She did not say anything. She just took his arm and held on. The drive home was quiet. Celine kept her eyes on the road, and her mouth closed because every time she tried to form a sentence, something too large got in the way of it. She reached over once and put her hand over his. He let her. Outside, Gray Mill moved past the windows, dark and ordinary. Gas stations and traffic lights, and the late-night quiet of a city that had no idea what had just happened 2 blocks from Crescent Avenue. Silas stared out the passenger window and said almost nothing. Lila was still awake. She was sitting at the top of the stairs in her pajamas when they came through the front door. And when she saw her father's face, she stood up so fast she nearly tripped. She was young, and she tried very hard to be grown about most things. But she was young, and this was her father, and she could not be grown about this. "Dad, I'm fine." Silas went up the stairs to her and held her by the shoulders and looked her in the eyes. "I'm fine. It looks worse than it is. I need you to go back to bed. What happened? I'll explain everything tomorrow, I promise. Right now, I need you to go to sleep. He said it gently but firmly, the voice he used when a decision had already been made. She searched his face for a long moment, then nodded and went back to her room. He stood in the hallway until her door clicked shut. Celine cleaned his face at the kitchen sink with a damp cloth and said nothing about the way he flinched when she touched the swollen eye. She said nothing about the bruising that was darkening along his cheekbone, or the split lip, or the red marks the handcuffs had left around his wrists. Later, Silas sat alone in the living room in the dark in his father's old armchair, the worn one with the cracked leather armrest that nobody had ever replaced because getting rid of it had never felt like an option. He held his VFW pin in his fingers and turned it over and over in his palm. At the kitchen table, Celine had her laptop open. Her textbooks had been pushed aside. She was typing fast, jaw set, eyes sharp. She looked up. "First thing tomorrow," she said. "We file a complaint." Silas looked at her from across the dark room. He nodded slowly, but his face did not change. 2 days passed. Celine drove Silas to file the complaint. His orbital fracture made driving difficult, and she had refused to hear any argument about it. She sat beside him in the Internal Affairs office and kept her mouth shut with visible effort, while Silas sat across a desk from an officer who typed slowly and asked questions in a flat, practiced voice, and looked at Silas's bruised face with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned a long time ago not to react to anything. The complaint was accepted, logged. Silas was given a reference number on a small white slip of paper. Celine drove them home. Silas put the slip of paper on the kitchen counter. Celine picked it up, looked at it, and set it back down without a word. On the second day, Silas's phone rang just after noon. He was sitting in the living room with an ice pack held against his eye, still swollen, and now running a deep purple-green along the cheekbone, the orbital bone. The ER doctor the morning after the arrest had confirmed it, a hairline fracture. He had written it down on the discharge papers in careful clinical language that somehow made it feel both more real and less real at the same time. He looked at the screen. Otis Grant. Silas. Otis. Otis's voice was low and urgent in a way that was not like him. Otis was a man who delivered most news, good or bad, at approximately the same relaxed volume. This was different. "I need you to come over, or send Celine, right now. I have something you need to see." Otis Grant had lived 3 houses down from the Kane family since before Silas was born. He was older, retired from the postal service, and spent most evenings on his front porch in a weathered wooden chair that had been there so long it had left permanent marks on the floorboards. He drank decaf coffee after 6 and video called his sister in San Antonio every week without fail. That was exactly what he had been doing the night of the stop. Celine drove over alone. Silas's eye made driving difficult, and she had insisted. She found Otis waiting on the porch with his tablet in both hands, like he was holding something fragile. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He handed her the tablet. The video was not clean. It was shot at a downward angle from the porch railing, roughly 40 feet from the street, the image slightly grainy in the low light. Otis's sister's voice was audible in the background of the recording. She had been mid-sentence about something when it had all begun, and the call had kept running without either of them noticing, but the street was visible. Silas's Buick was visible, pulled over at the curb. Under the gold wash of a street lamp. Officer Ryder standing at the driver's window was visible, and what happened next was completely, undeniably visible. Silas's hands on the steering wheel, both of them still. Ryder's arm swinging through the open window. Silas's body snapping sideways from the impact. Amara Quinn standing at the rear of the vehicle, motionless, watching. Celine watched it twice, then a third time. She did not cry right away. She sat very still on Otis's porch with the tablet in her lap and breathed carefully through her nose, because if she started, she was not sure she would be able to stop. And there was too much to do. "You didn't know you had this," she said. "I didn't know until Mrs. Patterson told me what happened to Silas," Otis said. "I went back through the call recording and there it was." He shook his head slowly. "I sat right there and watched the whole thing happen, and I didn't even know." Celine stood up. "I need to take this." "It's yours," Otis said. "Whatever you need." She called Vivian Cross from the car before she had even pulled out of Otis's driveway. Vivian Cross was not easy to get on the phone. She had a receptionist and a paralegal and a voicemail message that was professionally warm and said she would return all calls within 1 business day. Celine called the main number, got the receptionist, and said 4 words that moved her straight through. "We have it on video." Vivian was on the line in under a minute. Celine talked. Vivian listened without interrupting, which Celine would later say was one of the most reassuring things that had ever happened to her. When Celine finished, there was a brief pause. "Can you be in my office tomorrow morning?" Vivian said. "We'll be there early," Celine said. Vivienne Cross watched the footage 4 times without speaking. Then she set the tablet down on her desk, folded her hands, and looked at Silas directly. "This video changes everything," she said. Her voice was calm and certain. "But prepare yourselves. They will fight back hard." Silas met her eyes. "Let them," he said. Weeks was a long time to wait. Silas had gone back to work at Gray Mill High the Monday after the incident, bruised eye and all. He had stood in front of his staff at the morning briefing and answered their questions directly and without drama, the same way he handled everything. His students had stared. Some of them had asked. He had told them the truth in the plainest language he could find, that something had happened that was not right, and that he was handling it through the proper channels. He had believed that when he said it. Weeks later, Vivian Cross called him on a morning while he was eating breakfast before work. He knew from the first half-second of silence after he answered that the news was not good. "They reinstated him," Vivian said. Silas set his fork down. "Full back pay," she continued. "The Internal Affairs report states that your movement toward the glove box constituted a, and I'm reading this directly, sudden ambiguous movement that reasonably caused the officer to perceive a potential threat." The kitchen was very quiet. "They watched the same video we watched," Silas said. "They wrote the report under Crow's supervision," Vivian said. "I want you to come into the office today. There is more you need to hear." The criminal charges had not been dropped. That was the second thing. The county prosecutor, a man named Willard Langford, who had run unopposed in the last several elections with full police union endorsement, had confirmed that morning that the obstruction and resisting arrest charges against Silas Kane were moving forward. Silas sat across from Vivian in her office and listened without interrupting. "He's prosecuting me," Silas said when she finished. It was not a question. It was the sound of something clicking into place that he had hoped would not. "He is," Vivian said. "But there is something else." She slid a folder across the desk. "I filed a records request days ago for all complaint records related to Officer Ryder. This came back yesterday." Silas opened the folder. Inside were 2 complaint reports, both formally closed. One filed by a black teenager years earlier, excessive force during a stop, withdrawn after the teenager was cited on an unrelated infraction weeks later. The second filed by a Latino store owner. Same pattern, closed without investigation inside of a week. Both files had Captain Harlan Crow's signature on the closure paperwork. Silas read them slowly. Then he closed the folder and pushed it back across the desk. "How many times," he said quietly, "does a man have to do something before somebody stops him?" Vivian looked at him steadily. "That is exactly the question I intend to ask in federal court." She had already prepared the filing. She walked him through it. A federal civil rights lawsuit naming Officer Kane Ryder, Captain Harlan Crow, and the city of Graymill as defendants. Excessive force, civil rights violations, systemic failure to supervise and discipline a known offender, multi-million dollars in damages. Silas read the filing carefully all the way through. When he finished, he looked up at Vivian and said, "File it." The news broke by evening. By the next morning, it was on every local station, and 2 regional outlets had picked it up. Graymill principal sues city, officer, and police captain for millions. The story had the video. Otis had given permission to release a portion of it. And the clip, 11 seconds, Silas's hands on the wheel, Ryder's arm, the impact, played on a loop behind every news anchor who covered it. Graymill erupted. That Friday night, someone organized a vigil on Crescent Avenue. Silas had not asked anyone to do it. He had not known it was happening until Otis called him and told him to look out his front window. There were close to 200 people on the street, candles, signs, his students, kids he had spent years fighting for in board meetings and parent conferences, standing in the evening dark, holding handwritten posters with his name on them. Teachers from his school, neighbors who had known him his whole life, people he had never met, who had seen 11 seconds of video and driven across town. Silas stood on his front porch and looked at all of it. Celine stood behind him in the doorway with her arms folded, jaw tight, eyes bright. Lila slipped her hand into his from the left side. He covered her hand with his and stood there in the cold and the candlelight. And for the first time since that night, he let himself feel something that was not dread. He let himself hope. The city's response came exactly 1 week after the lawsuit was filed. Silas had expected pushback. Vivian had told him to expect it. She had used the word aggressive, and she had meant it. But knowing something is coming and standing in front of it when it arrives are 2 different things. Garrett Voss was silver-haired and had been the city of Graymill's lead municipal attorney for years. He wore good suits and spoke in the measured, reasonable tone of a man who had spent his entire career making unreasonable things sound perfectly sensible. He had never lost a case against the city. He intended to keep it that way. His opening move was not made in a courtroom. It was made on a blog. The site was called Graymill Straight Talk. It had a few thousand regular readers, mostly local, and a writer who had spent years cultivating a reputation as a plain-spoken truth-teller while quietly running favorable stories for anyone willing to feed him information. On a morning days after the lawsuit went public, a new post appeared. The headline read, "Who is Silas Kane, really?" A look behind the headline. Silas read it at his kitchen table before work. The post led with the grievance. Years ago, early in Silas's tenure as principal, a parent had filed a formal complaint over a student suspension Silas had ordered. The complaint had gone to the school board for review. The board had investigated and ruled entirely in Silas's favor. The matter had been closed and never mentioned again. The blog post described it as a pattern of heavy-handed leadership that drew formal board scrutiny. Then came the parking citation. Years old. Silas had left his car too long at a meter outside a restaurant on a Saturday afternoon. He had paid the fine the same day. The blog post called it a documented history of disregarding traffic regulations. Silas read the whole thing twice. Then he set his phone face down on the table and sat very still for a moment. "Let me see it," Celine said from across the table. He slid the phone to her. She read it. The color in her face changed. "This is," she started. "I know what it is," Silas said. Vivian called before long. "I've seen it," she said before Silas could speak. "I want you to listen to me carefully. This is standard procedure. This is what they do when they cannot attack the evidence. They attack the person. They are looking for anything that creates doubt, anything that makes a jury look at you and wonder, even for a second, if maybe you are not quite who you say you are." Her voice was controlled, but there was something sharp underneath it. "They went through years of your record and found a resolved parent complaint and a parking ticket. That tells you everything about what they actually have." "It's already spreading," Silas said. "It will spread further before it stops," Vivian said. "Do not respond to it. Do not post about it. Do not let Selene post about it. Let me handle the narrative. Your job right now is to keep your head down and show up to that court hearing looking exactly like what you are." "And what is that?" Silas said. "A man who has done nothing wrong," Vivian said. Friday morning was cold and gray. The courthouse was a wide stone building on the corner of 5th and Market, 4 blocks from the center of Graymill. Silas arrived in the same charcoal slacks and pressed white shirt he had worn the night of the stop, his VFW pin on his lapel. Vivian met him on the front steps. There were about 30 of them lined up along the sidewalk outside the entrance. Police union members mostly, some in uniform, some not. They held signs that read, "Support our blue and back the badge" in thick black letters. One sign near the end of the line read, "Ryder did his job." Silas walked toward the entrance. The line quieted as he approached. Someone said something low that he did not catch. Someone else laughed. He did not look at them. He walked the length of that sidewalk with his chin level and his shoulders square and his eyes straight ahead. The same way he had walked through worse things in places far from Graymill, Ohio. One foot in front of the other. Steady. Unhurried. He pushed through the courthouse door and let it close behind him. Inside, he took his seat beside Vivian at the defense table. The courtroom was not yet in session. The benches behind him filled slowly with sound and movement. Silas stared straight ahead. His jaw was set. He did not say a word. The letter was waiting on his desk. Silas arrived at Graymill High at his usual time on the Monday morning after the court hearing, the same time he had arrived every working day for nearly 2 decades. He nodded to the security guard at the front entrance the way he always did. He walked the main hallway the way he always did, past the trophy cases, and the student artwork, and the motivational posters he had personally chosen and hung during his first year as principal. His assistant principal, Daisy Quinn, was standing outside his office door. She was not usually standing outside his office door. She looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, something caught between sorrow and apology, and said, "There's a letter inside from the board. It came by courier this morning." Silas looked at her for a moment. Then he went inside and closed the door behind him. The letter was 2 paragraphs. The school board of Graymill, citing the ongoing criminal proceedings and the escalating nature of the associated publicity, was formally requesting that Principal Silas Kane take a temporary paid leave of absence, effective immediately, pending full resolution of all legal matters. The board chair's signature was at the bottom. There was no phone call attached to it, no meeting requested, no conversation offered. 2 paragraphs, a courier envelope, a signature. That was how they did it. Silas read it once. Then he folded it along its original crease and placed it in his inside jacket pocket. He stood behind his desk for a moment and looked at his office. The bookshelves he had filled himself, the framed photographs, his army unit, his graduating classes, Lila at a young age sitting in his principal's chair, pretending to sign papers. The small wooden plaque on the wall that one of his students had made for him in shop class years ago. It read, "Mr. K, you didn't give up on us." He picked up his personal items. There were not many. He had always traveled light. Daisy was still in the hallway. "How bad is it?" she asked quietly. "Temporary leave," Silas said. "Effective today." She pressed her lips together hard. Her eyes went bright for a moment before she controlled it. "Silas, keep the ship running," he said. "You know everything that needs doing. You don't need me standing over your shoulder." He said it the way he always said difficult things, directly, without softness, but without coldness either. Just the plain truth, delivered clean. He walked back down the main hallway toward the front entrance, past the trophy cases, past the student artwork, past the motivational posters. This time, he did not look at any of it. Celine was at the kitchen table when he got home. She took one look at him walking through the door early in the morning with a small box of personal items under his arm, and she knew immediately. "No," she said. "Temporary," Silas said. "Paid. That's not the point, and you know it." She stood up. "They're punishing you. You didn't do anything to anything, and they are punishing you for it. You have given that school years." Celine. No, Silas. I'm not going to sit here and be calm about this. This is wrong. All of it is wrong. You need to call Vivian right now and tell her what they just did. And then you need to think seriously about the settlement offer, because this is costing you everything, and they are not stopping. "I'm not settling," Silas said. His voice was quiet. Final. The kind of quiet that does not invite negotiation. Celine stopped. She looked at him for a long moment, jaw tight, eyes wet at the edges. "They're going to keep coming," she said. "You know that." "I know," he said. "And you're still not going to stop." "No," he said, I'm not." That evening, Silas cooked dinner. Chicken and rice, the same meal he had been making on certain nights since Lila was small. He stood at the stove and cooked it the same way he always had. And when Lila came downstairs and asked why he was home early, he told her calmly that he was taking a little time away from work and that everything was fine. She looked at him the way teenagers look at parents when they do not believe them, but love them too much to say so. After dinner, she helped him with the dishes without being asked. Later, when the house was quiet and Lila was asleep, Silas sat at the kitchen table alone with Vivian's case notes spread in front of him. He read through them slowly, carefully, all the way to the last page. Then he started again from the beginning. The weeks after the leave of absence moved slowly. Silas fell into a routine the way he always did when things were hard. Structure over feeling, motion over stillness. He was up early every morning. He ran. He made breakfast. He read through case documents. He called Vivian every other day for updates. He helped Lila with homework in the evenings and cooked dinner on a schedule and kept the house in the same quiet order it had always been in. He did not talk about how he felt. Celine watched him from across rooms and said nothing because she knew him well enough to know that pushing him would only make him go quieter. It was on a rainy evening, weeks into the leave, that everything shifted. Vivienne Cross was alone in her office. Her paralegal had gone home hours earlier. The building was quiet, except for the rain against the windows and the low hum of the heating system. She was reviewing deposition schedules when she heard a knock at the outer door. She was not expecting anyone. She opened the door and found Officer Amara Quinn standing in the hallway, still in her civilian clothes, rain-damp and visibly tense. She was holding her jacket closed at the front with one hand, even though she was already indisposed out of the cold. Her eyes moved once down the hallway in both directions before settling on Vivian. "I wasn't followed," she said before Vivian could speak. "I checked. Vivienne stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in." Quinn sat on the edge of the chair across from Vivienne's desk, like she was prepared to stand up again at any moment. She was young and looked younger than that tonight, her composure carefully assembled and showing the effort it was taking to keep it together. "I need to know this stays between us for now," Quinn said. "Tell me what you have," Vivienne said. "Then we'll talk about what happens next." Quinn was quiet for a moment. Then she began. She had grown up in Graymill. Her mother had attended the same church as Silas's late mother for years. She had known the Kane name her whole life. She had told herself on the night of the stop that there was nothing she could have done. She had been telling herself that every day since. She did not believe it anymore. "Before he pulled Silas over," Quinn said, her voice carefully controlled, "Kane made a comment under his breath about the neighborhood, about the people who live there." She paused. It wasn't the first time I'd heard him talk like that. It wasn't the second time either. Vivienne did not reach for her pen. Not yet. She kept her eyes on Quinn and let her speak. "The morning after," Quinn continued, "Captain Crow called me. Personal cell, not department line. He told me to keep my account simple and consistent with Kane's report." She looked directly at Vivienne. "He didn't tell me to lie. He was too careful for that. But we both knew what he meant." The rain tapped steadily against the office window. Vivienne picked up her pen. "I need you to understand what you're describing," Vivienne said. "A superior officer instructing a witness to align her testimony with a potentially false report. That is witness interference. That changes the nature of this case significantly." "I know what it is," Quinn said, "and you understand what coming forward will cost you." Quinn looked at her hands for a moment, then back up. "Kane has 5 complaints buried in his file," she said. 5. And he is still out there with a badge and a gun because people like Crow keep making it easy for people like him. Her voice did not waver. "How many more Silas Kanes does there have to be before somebody does something?" Vivienne looked at her for a long moment. Then, "Let's do something," she said. She filed the new allegations the next morning, adding Crow as a direct co-conspirator and scheduling Quinn for formal deposition. By the end of the week, word had reached Crow. His response came the following Monday. Quinn was formally reassigned to overnight foot patrol in Gray Mills Industrial District, 6 square blocks of warehouses and empty lots on the eastern edge of the city. It was the departmental equivalent of a punishment posting, and everyone in the building knew it. Colleagues who had spoken to her the previous week now looked through her in the hallways. The union rep stopped by her desk and told her quietly, without malice, as though he were simply stating a weather forecast. "You made your bed." Quinn cleaned out her desk drawer without responding. That evening, Vivienne called Silas and told him what Quinn had said about Crow's phone call. Silas listened to the whole thing without speaking. When Vivienne finished, there was a long pause on the line. "She came forward anyway," Silas said. "She did," Vivienne said. Another pause. "Good," Silas said quietly. "Then we use it." The pre-trial motion hearing was on a morning in the colder months. Silas and Celine sat in the second row of the gallery behind Vivienne. The courtroom was smaller than the one they had been in for the criminal hearing. A civil courtroom, wood-paneled and fluorescent lit, half full on a weekday morning. Garrett Voss sat at the opposing table in another good suit, flanked by 2 younger attorneys who took notes continuously. Voss had not looked at Silas once since they entered the room. The motion was straightforward in its ask and significant in its implications. Vivienne was requesting that the court compel the city of Graymill to produce the full unredacted complaint history for Officer Kane Ryder. Every filing, every investigation record, every closure document going back to the beginning of his employment. Voss opposed it. He argued that releasing internal disciplinary records posed a risk to officer privacy and departmental security. His argument was polished and well-paced, and almost convincing. The judge took time to rule. Full disclosure, unredacted, due within 10 business days. Voss's pen stopped moving against his legal pad for just a moment. Then he wrote something down and kept his face completely still. The documents arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Vivian called Silas that evening. Her voice had the particular quality it got when she had found something significant, controlled, precise, and underneath it all, quietly electric. 5 complaints, she said. Years. 3 closed without investigation. 1 complainant had a warrant appear on his record weeks after filing. Convenient timing. The 5th was the teenager we already knew about, pressured into withdrawing. She paused. Crow's signature is on every single closure. Silas sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall. 5 people, he said. At minimum, Vivian said. These are only the ones who actually filed. You and I both know there are people who saw what Ryder was and decided it wasn't worth the trouble of reporting him. Because they knew nothing would happen, Silas said. Because they were right, Vivian said. Until now. Voss called Vivian the following Monday morning. She told Silas about the call that afternoon, sitting across from him and Celine in her office, with the complaint files stacked on the desk between them, like evidence of something that had always been true, but never been visible until now. The city was offering a settlement, hundreds of thousands of dollars, a formal written apology from the city of Graymill, Ryder's voluntary resignation from the department. Celine went very still when she heard the number. Silas looked at the surface of Vivian's desk. Voluntary resignation, he said. That's what they're offering, Vivian said. Meaning he walks out on his own terms, Silas said. Meaning there's no finding of wrongdoing on record. Meaning he keeps his certification and applies at the next department over. He said it without heat, just laying the logic out flat, where all 3 of them could look at it. Vivian nodded once. Celine leaned forward. Silas. Her voice was careful in the way it got when she had been preparing a sentence for a while. That is real money. That is Lila's college. That is the house paid off. That is you never having to go back to a job that put you on leave for something they did to you. She spread her hands. You have been fighting this for months. You have a fractured eye socket. You lost your job. Lila has watched all of this happen to her father. At some point what? Silas said. At some point you have to think about what more fighting is going to cost. The office was quiet. Silas looked at the stack of complaint files on the desk. The 5 closed investigations. The teenager who had been pressured into silence. The store owner whose complaint had disappeared inside a week. All the people who had come before him on Crescent Avenue, or somewhere like it, who had made the calculation that the system would not hear them, and had been exactly right. He looked at Vivian. Does this change anything? He said. For the next person they pull over? Vivian held his gaze. She did not look away, and she did not soften it. With a confidentiality clause attached, she said. Which it will be? No, it changes almost nothing. Silas picked up the settlement offer from the desk. He read it once, all the way through, slowly. Then he placed it back down and slid it across the desk toward Vivian with 2 fingers. Then we keep going, he said. Celine closed her eyes for a moment. Then she sat back in her chair and nodded once because she had known, if she was being honest with herself, exactly what he was going to say. The emergency motion landed on a Thursday. Vivian called Silas as soon as it hit her desk. Her voice was measured, but there was something underneath it that he had not heard before. A tightness, controlled and careful, like a wire pulled one turn too many. Garrett Voss had filed a motion to suppress Otis Grant's video. His argument was this. The recording had been captured inadvertently during a video call on a third-party platform in which a law enforcement interaction was recorded without the officer's knowledge or consent. Under Ohio wiretapping statutes, Voss argued, the admissibility of such a recording in civil proceedings was legally compromised. The language was dense and technical, and constructed with the precision of a man who had spent considerable time finding exactly the right angle of attack. "He's going after the video," Silas said. "He is," Vivian said. "Can he win?" A pause, brief but present. "I'm working on it," Vivian said. The judge granted a full evidentiary hearing on the video's admissibility. Days out. Silas sat with that information for the rest of the afternoon. Without the video, the case did not collapse entirely. They still had Quinn, still had the complaint files, still had the GPS records Vivian's paralegal had flagged. But the video was the spine of everything. It was the 11 seconds that made every other piece of evidence make sense to a jury. A regular person sitting in a box needed to see it. They needed to watch Silas's hands on that steering wheel and watch Ryder's arm come through that window. And then nothing Voss said for the rest of the trial would be able to undo what they had seen with their own eyes. Without it, the case became a question of who the jury believed. Silas knew exactly how that math worked for a black man in a mid-sized Ohio city going up against a police department. 2 days before the hearing, the county prosecutor moved. Willard Langford formally scheduled Silas's criminal trial, obstruction and resisting arrest, weeks out. The timing was not accidental, and everyone in Vivian's office knew it. A criminal conviction, even a misdemeanor, would gut the civil case. It would give Voss exactly the narrative he needed. The jury found him guilty of resisting. 6 words that would do more damage than anything else Voss could say. And a misdemeanor conviction would end Silas's career in education permanently. Vivian had days to save the video. She stayed in the office. Her paralegal left later. She told him to go home and get some rest, and she meant it. She needed him sharp in the morning. She stayed behind with the case files and her laptop and a yellow legal pad that she filled front and back by midnight. Her primary argument rested on a Sixth Circuit precedent involving the inadvertent recording of a public interaction. The case was strong. The parallels were clear. She had built the suppression defense around it carefully, and she knew it well. Late at night, her email notification chimed. Voss had filed a supplemental brief. She opened it. He had found a district court ruling from a previous year, a lower court decision, not binding, but recent and specific, that interpreted the same Ohio statute in a way that directly contradicted her Sixth Circuit argument. It was not a perfect counter. It was not even a particularly elegant one. But it was enough to introduce genuine uncertainty, and genuine uncertainty at an evidentiary hearing was enough to lose. Vivian read the ruling twice. Then she set it down on the desk and sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. The office was completely silent. She had been a civil rights attorney for years. She had taken cases that other lawyers would not touch. She had won in rooms where winning was not supposed to be possible. She had never, in all those years, allowed herself to cry over a case file. She cried now, not for long, not loudly. Just a few minutes in the empty office with the rain tapping against the dark window, alone with the weight of what it would mean to lose this. She did not allow herself more than a few minutes. That was the rule she set for herself when she was a young public defender, young and drowning in case loads that would have broken most people twice her age. You can feel it. You can sit with it for a few minutes and let it be as bad as it is. Then you pick up and you work. Vivian wiped her face, straightened in her chair, and picked up her phone. It was early morning. She scrolled to a name she had not called in almost 2 years. Professor David Anand, Ohio State University School of Law, Digital Evidence and Privacy Law. His specialty, his obsession. The thing he had spent decades becoming the foremost authority on in the state of Ohio. They had graduated from the same law school a year apart. He had clerked federal. She had gone public defender. They had stayed in loose but genuine contact ever since. She pressed call. It rang 4 times. Vivian. His voice was groggy but not alarmed. The voice of a man who had received calls at strange hours before and understood that they usually meant something. "What time is it?" "Early," she said. "I need your brain. I have a suppression hearing in hours, and Voss just dropped a district court ruling that I did not see coming." A pause, the sound of movement. Sheets, a lamp clicking on. "Send it to me," he said. "Give me a few minutes." She sent him the ruling. Then she sent him her primary argument, the Sixth Circuit precedent, the full, factual record of how Otis's recording had been made. She refilled her coffee cup, which had gone cold, and drank it cold anyway. Minutes later, Anand called back. "Okay," he said. "Voss is citing the pre-amendment version of the statute." Vivienne went still. "Say that again." The specific Ohio wiretapping provision he is hanging this argument on was amended years ago. The amendment added an explicit exemption for inadvertent recordings captured in public spaces that are visible from private residential property. She could hear him typing. "A porch, a public street. That is your case exactly. The version of the statute Voss cited in his brief has not been operative law for years." The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. "He missed it," Vivian said. "Or he hoped you would," Anand said. "Either way, you have it. I'll send you the amendment citation and the legislative notes right now." She worked until morning without stopping. By the time her paralegal arrived, she had rebuilt the suppression defense entirely around the amended statute. The new argument was not just a response to Voss. It made his entire motion look sloppy. It made him look like a man who had reached for a weapon in the dark and grabbed the wrong one. She drove to the courthouse with the brief printed and tabbed, and the amendment citation highlighted in 3 places. The hearing began later that morning. Voss presented his suppression argument first. He was as polished as always, his language precise and authoritative, his manner carrying the easy confidence of a man who had never seriously considered that he might be wrong. He cited the statute. He cited the district ruling. He built his case brick by brick and sat down looking like a man who had already won. Vivian stood up. She laid it out in plain, clear language. The amendment. The explicit exemption for inadvertent recordings from private residential property overlooking a public street. The fact that the statute Voss had built his entire argument around had not been current law since before he filed the motion. She placed the amendment text in front of the judge. She did not raise her voice. She did not editorialize. She simply showed the court what the law actually said. The judge read it. He asked Voss one question. Voss looked at his co-counsel. Something passed between them. A look quick and controlled, but not quick enough. But not. "The motion to suppress is denied," the judge said. "The recording is admissible." Vivian gathered her papers slowly and deliberately, the way she always did when she had won something that mattered. At the opposing table, Garrett Voss sat very still. His pen was down. He was staring at a fixed point on the table in front of him, with the careful blankness of a man managing something he did not want anyone in the room to see. His co-counsel leaned in and said something quietly. Voss did not respond. She called Silas from the courthouse steps, coat pulled tight against the cold. He answered on the second ring. "The video stands," she said. The exhale on the other end of the line was long and slow, and said more than words would have. "Good," Silas said when it was done. His voice was steady again, back on solid ground. "Now what do we do with the rest of it?" "I've been working on exactly that," Vivian said. "I know you have," he said. The criminal defense preparation began the following week. Vivian's office transformed over the course of those days. The long table against the wall, usually clear, disappeared under organized rows of documents. Ryder's full employment file, the city's discovery production, dispatch logs, incident reports, going back years. Her paralegal, a meticulous young man named Tristan, had developed a system of color-coded folders that Vivian had adopted without comment because it was genuinely better than her own. Silas came in one afternoon to review the criminal defense strategy. He sat across from Vivian and worked through the documents with the careful attention of a man who had learned over the past several months that every word mattered, and that the details you skipped were usually the ones that came back to hurt you. He left later. Tristan stayed until late. It was Tristan who found it. He was working through the city's employment file production one morning, the kind of document review that required sustained grinding attention and rewarded it only occasionally. Page after page of administrative forms, scheduling records, equipment logs, training certifications. Then a GPS dispatch log. Routine, the kind of record generated automatically by the department's cruiser tracking system. Every time an officer activated their dash-mounted radio or called in a location. Tristan read the entry twice. Then he printed it, walked to Vivian's office doorway, and knocked on the frame. "I need you to look at something," he said. Vivian read the log entry standing up, which was what she always did when Tristan brought her something he had knocked on the door to show her, rather than simply emailed. The entry showed Ryder's cruiser activating its radio on Crescent Avenue at a certain time on the night of the incident. His incident report stated the traffic stop had begun 11 minutes later. 11 minutes. Vivian set the log down and picked up Ryder's incident report. She found the timestamp, clear and specific. She read the narrative section, the alleged lane change, the decision to initiate the stop, the approach to the vehicle. There was no mention of being parked on Crescent Avenue beforehand, no mention of arriving early, no explanation for the 11-minute gap between the GPS activation and the stated stop time. She set both documents side by side on her desk. "Pull the convenience store footage," she said. "The external camera on the corner of Crescent and Millard. It was part of the original subpoena. I want to know if we can see that block." Tristan had it on her screen in a short time. The footage was grainy and shot at a wide angle, catching the corner of Crescent Avenue at the edge of its frame. It was not ideal, but it was enough. At the earlier time, a police cruiser was visible at the curb on Crescent Avenue. Parked. Engine running. The exhaust visible in the cold air. Lights off. It sat there, unmoving for 11 minutes. Then Silas's Buick came into the edge of the frame. The cruiser's lights came on immediately. It pulled out. There had been no lane change to observe. Ryder had not been driving behind Silas when he decided to pull him over. He had been stationary, waiting, for 11 minutes before Silas ever came down that street. He had not reacted to a traffic violation. He had been hunting. Vivian sat with that word for a moment. Then she called Silas. She told him what the GPS log showed. She told him about the convenience store footage. She explained the timeline carefully, walking him through each piece the way she always did. No shortcuts, no assumptions, making sure he understood every step of what it meant. When she finished, the line was quiet. "He was waiting for me," Silas said. It was not a question. It was not outrage either. Not exactly. It was something quieter and more terrible than outrage. The sound of a thing you had half known being confirmed beyond any possibility of doubt. "Yes," Vivian said. "And that changes what this is." She explained the federal statute, criminal deprivation of rights under color of law. A federal crime, not a departmental policy violation, not an excessive force civil claim. A criminal act, premeditated, carried out by a man wearing a badge and acting in the name of the law. I'm contacting the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Ohio today, Vivian said. I'm handing them everything: the GPS log, the store footage, the complaint files, Quinn's testimony, Crow's phone call. All of it. Do it, Silas said. His voice was completely steady. Silas, Vivian said carefully. When this becomes a federal investigation, it becomes public. It becomes very large, very fast. There will be no more quiet, no more managing the pace of this. Good, Silas said. A beat of silence. I've been quiet long enough, he said. The federal investigation became public on a Wednesday. By the next morning, it was on every local station and 3 national outlets. By the end of the week, it was everywhere. The story was not just about a punch through a car window anymore. It was about a police officer who had parked his cruiser on a residential street and waited. It was about a captain who had buried 5 complaints and called a witness the morning after. It was about a city that had known and done nothing year after year because doing nothing was easier and cheaper than doing what was right. Graymill had nowhere left to hide. The city council called an emergency session that Friday afternoon. Silas watched it on the news from his living room. Celine sat beside him on the couch. Lila was at school. The television showed the council chamber, 12 people around a long table, most of them visibly uncomfortable, all of them aware that cameras were rolling and that whatever they decided in the next hour would be on record permanently. The vote to terminate Officer Kane Ryder took 4 minutes. Not to accept his resignation, not to place him on extended leave, to terminate him. Fired. The distinction was deliberate, and the council chair said so directly into the microphone, that in light of the federal investigation and the evidence presented by the U.S. Attorney's Office, a resignation would not be sufficient and would not be accepted. The vote was unanimous. Celine made a short, sharp sound beside Silas on the couch. Not quite a word, something between relief and vindication that did not have a word attached to it. Silas watched the screen and said nothing. His face was still, but his hand, resting on his knee, closed slowly into a fist and then opened again. Ryder's law enforcement certification was referred to the Ohio Peace Officer Training Commission the same afternoon. The referral was for permanent revocation. It meant that even if another department in another county decided they wanted to take a chance on a fired officer with a federal investigation hanging over him, the state could prevent it. His attorney released a statement that said very little and convinced no one. Captain Harlan Crow was placed on administrative leave by Monday morning. The phone records had come back over the weekend. The U.S. Attorney's subpoena had moved fast, and the records were clear. Crow had called Quinn from his personal cell the morning after the incident. The call had lasted a few minutes. That was a few minutes of a senior police captain telling a junior officer how to remember something she had witnessed. The call log was 3 lines on a phone bill. It was enough. The city manager issued a statement saying that Captain Crow had agreed to retire, effective immediately, in lieu of termination proceedings. A separate inquiry by the Ohio Attorney General's office was opening into Crow's handling of the 5 buried complaints, whether the closures constituted obstruction of justice and violation of departmental duty. Crow did not appear publicly. He did not release a statement. He was simply gone. The school board met on a Tuesday evening. Silas did not attend the meeting. Vivian had advised against it, and he had agreed. His presence would make it political when it needed to be straightforward. He stayed home and waited. Celine went. She sat in the public gallery and did not say a word, and did not need to. The room was full. Parents, teachers, community members. A dozen of Silas's former students who had driven across town on a Tuesday night to sit in those chairs and make their presence felt. The vote to reinstate Silas Kane as principal of Gray Mill High School, with full back pay covering his entire leave period, was unanimous. The board chair read a formal written apology into the record. It cited the board's regret for placing Silas on leave and acknowledged that the decision had caused him professional and personal harm. It was careful and formal and constructed by lawyers, and it did not say nearly enough, but it was on the record, permanent and public, and attached to his name in exactly the right direction. Celine texted Silas from the gallery while the chair was still reading. Unanimous. Full back pay. They apologized on the record. His response came back in under a minute. Dud. Okay, just that. One word. She stared at it for a moment, and then smiled despite herself, because that was Silas. 2 syllables where anyone else would have used 20. The criminal charges were dropped on a Wednesday morning. Willard Langford's office filed the dismissal quietly in a 2-paragraph press release that cited newly discovered evidence fundamentally altering the circumstances of the original charges. There was no apology, no press conference, no acknowledgement of what those charges had cost Silas over the past several months. 2 paragraphs. Silas read it at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold beside him. Vivienne called while he was still reading. "It's done," she said. "All charges dismissed." The line was quiet for a moment. "Now we finish it," Silas said. The civil trial began on a Monday morning. Silas wore the charcoal slacks and the pressed white shirt, the VFW pin on his lapel, the same clothes he had been wearing the night it all started months ago on Crescent Avenue. He had not planned it consciously. He had simply reached into his closet that morning and known. The courtroom was standing room only. Vivienne presented the case across 4 days with the methodical precision of someone who had spent months making sure that when this moment came, there would be nothing left to chance. Day 1 was the evidence. The video first. Otis's footage played on the courtroom screen in full without narration or commentary. 11 seconds. Silas's hands on the wheel, Ryder's arm through the window. The impact. Quinn standing still at the rear of the vehicle. Vivienne let it run once, and then let the silence after it sit in the room for a long moment before she said another word. Then the GPS log, the convenience store footage, side by side on the screen, the timestamps aligned, the cruiser visible at the curb 11 minutes before the stop. Vivienne walked the jury through the timeline slowly, step by step, the way you explain something to someone you respect enough to make sure they understand it completely. There had been no lane change. There had been no traffic violation. There had been a man with a badge and a cruiser parked on a residential street waiting. She could see it land on the jury the moment it moved from information to understanding. Row 1, seat 3, a middle-aged man who had driven a delivery route in Gray Mill for years, leaned back slightly in his chair and looked at the screen for a long time after Vivienne moved on. Day 2 was the complaint files. 5 complaints. Years. 3 closed without investigation. 1 complainant cited on an outstanding warrant that appeared weeks after he filed. 1 teenager pressured into withdrawal. Vivienne presented each one individually, walking the jury through the dates, the allegations, the closure signatures. Crow's name again and again at the bottom of paperwork that should have gone somewhere and instead went nowhere. Garrett Voss cross-examined carefully and professionally and accomplished very little. The documents said what they said. Day 3 was Amara Quinn. She took the stand in her civilian clothes. Crow's suspension had held, and she had been without pay for weeks. She sat straight and spoke clearly, and did not look away from the jury when she described the night on Crescent Avenue. She told them about Ryder's comment before the stop, the words he had used about the neighborhood, about the people who lived there. She told them she had heard him talk that way before. She told them she had stood at the rear of Silas's car and done nothing. And she said it without flinching, without excuse, with the plain honesty of someone who had already reckoned with what her silence had caused. Then she described Crow's phone call, the morning after. His careful, deliberate instructions to keep her account simple and consistent with Ryder's report. A juror in the second row, a white woman, in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back neatly, put her hand slowly over her mouth. She kept it there for a long time. Voss's cross-examination of Quinn was the most aggressive moment of the trial. He pressed her on her motivations, her timing, her relationship with Vivian's office. Quinn answered every question in the same steady voice. She did not rattle. She did not retreat. She sat in that chair like a woman who had already paid the price for telling the truth and had decided it was worth it. Day 4. Silas took the stand. He did not perform. He did not dramatize. He simply told the truth in the plainest language he knew, starting with the school play and the old song and the 2 blocks from his own front door. He described the stop, the registration reach, the first punch, the second, the hours in the holding cell with the fluorescent light that never changed, the fractured orbital bone, the letter from the school board, the months of sitting at his kitchen table reading case files in the house where he had raised his daughter. He talked about his students, the ones who had written him letters during the leave, the ones who had held signs in the school parking lot, the ones who were watching this trial from their phones in study hall because nobody had told them not to, and they were going to anyway. He said it all in the same measured, unhurried voice, looking at the jury, the way he had always looked at a room full of young people who needed to understand something important. The woman in the second row had her hand over her mouth again. The jury deliberated for hours. The 4-person stood. The courtroom was absolutely silent. We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Silas Elroy Kane. Total damages, $3 million. $1.2 million in compensatory damages, $1.8 million in punitive damages assessed against the city of Gray Mill. The 4-person looked up from the paper and directly at the city's table before sitting back down. Behind Silas, the gallery erupted. He sat very still in his chair for a moment, both hands flat on the table in front of him. Then he turned and found Celine in the front row of the gallery. She had both hands pressed over her face. Her shoulders were shaking. He reached back over the railing and covered her hands with his. The courthouse doors opened onto winter sunlight. It was the kind of light that comes low and sharp off the cold air, the kind that makes everything look cleaner than it is. Silas stepped through the doors and stopped for a moment at the top of the steps, just breathing it in. Behind him, the gallery was still emptying, voices spilling out around him, but for just that 1 second, he stood still and let the light hit his face. Vivian came through the door beside him. Celine took his arm on the other side. Below them, the courthouse steps ran down to the sidewalk where Gray Mill had gathered. They were everywhere. Otis Grant stood at the bottom of the steps in his good coat, the dark wool one he saved for church and funerals, and apparently this, already talking loudly to a woman beside him, gesturing with both hands, clearly already telling the story of the tablet. He had been telling it for months to anyone who would listen, and he showed no signs of stopping. Behind him were faces Silas knew and faces he did not. Teachers from Gray Mill High, some of whom had driven straight from the school on their lunch break. Neighbors from Crescent Avenue. People from the community who had watched 11 seconds of footage on the local news months earlier and had not forgotten. Parents of students. Former students themselves, some still teenagers, some in their early 20s, some who had sat in Silas's office for disciplinary hearings and college application help and conversations that had mattered more than either of them had said out loud at the time. They had all come. A reporter pushed forward with a microphone and a camera operator tight behind her. She was young and professional, and her question was direct. "Mr. Kane, what did you want people to take away from what happened here today?" Silas looked at her for a moment. He reached up and straightened his VFW pin. Then he looked into the camera. "I spent nearly 2 decades teaching young people that this country can live up to what it says it believes," he said. His voice was the same voice he used in front of his school, clear and unhurried, carrying without being raised. That the system is worth fighting, that the institutions are worth holding to account, that if you do the right thing, and you stand your ground, and you refuse to be made small, eventually, the truth finds its way into the light. He paused. Days like today, I still believe that. He let the words sit for a moment, but it cost something. It always costs something. A fractured bone, months away from the school I built, watching my daughter watch me go through this and not being able to protect her from it. His jaw tightened briefly and then released. That is the real price, not the legal fees, not the time, the people you love having to carry it with you. The crowd on the steps had gone quiet. The people who make it cost that much, who count on good people being too tired or too scared or too alone to keep fighting. I want them to understand something. He looked directly into the lens. We are not as alone as you think, and we are not as tired as you are hoping. The crowd erupted, not politely, not the restrained applause of a press conference, fully, loudly, the way people respond when something has been said that they have needed to hear for a long time. Celine squeezed his arm so hard it would leave a mark. She was not trying to hide the fact that she was crying, and she had stopped trying somewhere around day 3 of the trial. From the bottom of the steps, cutting clearly through everything else, Otis Grant's voice rose above the noise. "And we got it on video." The laughter that followed was immediate and total. It rolled up the steps and broke over the crowd and kept going. Silas felt it move through him before he could stop it, starting somewhere in his chest and coming up and out of him completely. Full and real and unguarded. The kind of laugh that takes over your whole body and doesn't ask permission. He laughed for a long time, and then from somewhere behind him, a pair of arms wrapped around him from the side. Small, but fierce, holding on, like she had been waiting all morning to do it, and was not planning to let go soon. Lila. She had come straight from school, still in her backpack. Silas wrapped both arms around his daughter and held her tight against his chest there on the courthouse steps in the winter sunlight, while Gray Mill celebrated around them. He closed his eyes. He held on. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.